Look, I'm just going to say it straight up. My perfect life got totally wrecked over something that wasn't even my fault. And now everyone's acting like I'm the villain in this whole mess. I'm Lyra. I'm 29. And honestly, I still can't believe how everything went so wrong so fast. So, there I was, living what I thought was my dream life with my fiancé Sterling. We've been engaged for 8 months, and everything seemed perfect on the outside. We had this cute little place together, wedding planned for next spring, the whole thing. I was working part-time while Sterling handled most of our bills with his steady job. Everyone always said we looked so happy together, and I guess we were mostly. But here's the thing. Nobody really talks about relationships or work, you know? Like Sterling would get all weird about me bringing up my ex Ronan sometimes. I mean, we dated for 6 years. He was a huge part of my life, so obviously he's going to come up in conversation. But Sterling would get this look on his face like I was doing something wrong just by mentioning him. And Sterling had his own issues too. He was always checking up on me, asking where I'd been, who I was talking to. Meanwhile, I respected his privacy completely. Well, okay. Maybe I'd glance at his phone sometimes when he left it out, but that's just normal girlfriend behavior, right? But when he'd ask about my day or who I'd been texting, I'd get defensive because it felt controlling. The worst part was how he'd criticize my friends. Like, he never said it directly, but he'd make these little comments about how they were dramatic or high maintenance. Meanwhile, his buddies were total losers who just sat around playing video games and complaining about their lives. But did I say anything? No, because I'm not that type of person. Money was becoming an issue too. Sterling kept hinting that maybe I should look for full-time work to help with wedding expenses. But hello? Planning a wedding is basically a full-time job in itself. Plus, my part-time schedule gave me flexibility to handle all the household stuff and social planning. When he brought it up, I'd usually just shut down because it felt like he was pressuring me. I'll admit, I kept track of things. Not in a petty way, but like when I'd do something nice for him, make his favorite dinner, pick up his dry cleaning, organize his closet, and he wouldn't even notice or say thank you. Those things add up, you know, and when we'd have disagreements, I'd bring up examples of how thoughtful I'd been just to show him I was trying. His coworkers were another issue. There were these women at his office who clearly had crushes on him, and when I'd mention it, he'd act like I was being paranoid. But I could tell women know these things. I'd suggest maybe he shouldn't go to happy hours with them or text them about work stuff after hours, and he'd get all defensive about it. The thing is, I've been through a lot in my life. My parents had this horrible divorce when I was 15, and it really messed me up about trust and commitment. So, when Sterling would try to have these serious talks about our future or bring up issues in our relationship, it would trigger all that trauma. I'd explain that to him, how these conversations made me feel like everything was falling apart, and usually he'd back off and apologize. Everything was going fine until that Tuesday in March when my phone rang during dinner. I saw the name and my stomach just dropped. It was Ronan's sister, and I knew immediately something was wrong. When she told me Ronan had died from cancer, I just went completely silent. Sterling kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't even speak. Cancer? Ronan was only 31. How was this possible? And why didn't I know he was sick? Well, actually, I did know he'd been having some health issues, but I thought it was just stress from work or something. We'd been texting on and off, just as friends, checking in on each other, but he never told me it was serious. When I finally told Sterling what happened, his reaction was so typical. Instead of comforting me, he started asking all these questions about when I'd last talked to Ronan and why I didn't mention he was sick. I tried to explain that I didn't really know the details, that we weren't in regular contact or anything. But Sterling had this look like he didn't believe me. The funeral completely destroyed me. Seeing Ronan's family again, his mom hugging me and crying about how much he'd loved me. It brought back everything. All our mutual friends were there, people I hadn't seen since we broke up, and they were all so sweet to me. They remembered how long we'd been together, how serious we were. I spent most of the service crying, thinking about all the plans we used to make, all the dreams we shared. His sister gave this speech about how he never stopped talking about our relationship, how it was the happiest time of his life. When people came up to me afterwards, they kept saying things like, "You were the love of his life," and asking if I was okay. Sterling texted me during the reception, asking when I'd be home. And honestly, it felt so selfish. Here I was grieving and processing this huge loss, and he was worried about dinner timing or whatever. I ended up staying later than planned because Ronan's college friends wanted to share stories, and it felt healing to remember the good times. When I got home, Sterling was waiting up with this attitude. He asked how it went, but in that fake, concerned way where you can tell someone's actually annoyed. Then he asked who was there and started questioning me about conversations I'd had with people. That's when I realized Sterling didn't understand grief at all. He'd never lost anyone important, never had to say goodbye to someone who shaped who you are. So, when I needed space to process everything, when I couldn't just bounce back to normal life the next day, he took it personally. But here's what I haven't told anyone. What's been eating me alive since it happened? The week before Ronan died, he'd reached out to me, not through Facebook or anything public. He had my number and texted me directly. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just asking how I was doing, saying he'd been thinking about me. But then the conversation got deeper. He told me he was scared, really scared about dying, about being alone, about all the things he'd never get to do. And honestly, my heart broke for him. I mean, imagine being 31 and facing that kind of future. So, when he asked if I could come see him just to talk and maybe bring some comfort to his last days, how could I say no? I told Sterling I was going shopping with my sister that Saturday. I know how that sounds, but what was I supposed to say? Hey babe, my dying ex-boyfriend wants to see me one last time. Sterling was already being weird about me grieving. He would have completely lost it if he knew Ronan was reaching out. When I got to Ronan's apartment, he looked so different, thin, just not the strong guy I remembered. We talked for hours about everything, old memories, regrets, fears about what comes next. He kept thanking me for coming, saying most people had abandoned him when he got sick, that I was the only person who really understood him. The conversation got emotional, and he started talking about how our relationship was the best time of his life, how he never stopped loving me even after we broke up. I tried to keep things appropriate, but seeing him so vulnerable and scared just broke my heart. When he asked if I would stay the night just to be there with him so he wouldn't have to face another night alone with his thoughts, I couldn't say no. What happened next? I still don't know how to process. He said he had one last request, something that would help him find peace before he died. He wanted to feel close to someone who loved him, to have one final moment of connection before everything ended. And looking at him so sick and desperate and afraid, I couldn't bear to deny him that. So yes, we were intimate that night. But it wasn't about me. It wasn't about betraying Sterling or being selfish. It was about giving comfort to someone who was dying, about showing compassion in his darkest moment. Anyone who's ever watched someone they cared about suffer would understand that sometimes you do things out of love that don't fit into normal rules. I stayed until morning, holding him while he slept, knowing it might be one of the last peaceful nights he'd have. When I left, he thanked me over and over, said I'd given him something beautiful to hold on to in his final days. How could that be wrong? The guilt was eating me alive, though. Not because of what I'd done. I still believe it was the right thing, but because I knew Sterling would never understand. He's not the type of person who thinks about bigger pictures or moral complexities. He sees everything in black and white, right and wrong, with no room for nuance. So, I kept it to myself, carried this huge secret while trying to act normal. Every time Sterling would ask about my mood or why I seemed distant, I'd have to pretend it was just regular grief. But how do you explain that kind of emotional weight to someone who's never been in that position? I started picking fights with Sterling over stupid stuff because I was so stressed, and he was being so unsympathetic about everything. Like he'd leave dishes in the sink and I'd explode. Or he'd forget to pick up milk, and I'd act like it was this huge betrayal, but really I was just overwhelmed with keeping the secret and dealing with his constant questions about my emotional state. Sterling kept trying to have these deep conversations about us and moving forward and getting back to normal. Normal. Nothing about this situation was normal. I just lost someone important to me, someone who'd been a huge part of my life, and Sterling wanted me to just bounce back like nothing happened. When he suggested Koo's therapy, I actually laughed. What were we going to tell the therapist? That my fiancé couldn't handle me grieving properly? That he was jealous of a dead person? The whole idea was ridiculous, and it showed how little he understood about what I was going through. The worst part was how he'd analyze everything I did. If I seemed sad, he'd ask why. If I seemed okay, he'd ask if I was really okay or just pretending. There was no winning with him. He wanted me to be healed, but also wanted to control how that healing looked. 3 weeks after the funeral, I was having the worst day yet. I'd barely slept, kept having dreams about Ronan's last night, and I felt like I was drowning in this secret. When Sterling came home and immediately started asking questions about my mood, I just snapped. I told him I needed him to back off, to give me space to grieve without constantly checking up on me. But instead of listening, he got defensive and started listing all the ways he'd been supportive. That's when he said something that really set me off. He said maybe I was too attached to Ronan's memory, that it wasn't healthy to be this affected by an ex-boyfriend's death. The fight escalated quickly. Sterling accused me of shutting him out and not communicating, while I accused him of being controlling and unsupportive. Round and round we went, saying things we probably shouldn't have, until finally he asked the question that changed everything. Did you sleep with him? Just like that, out of nowhere. I guess all his suspicions and insecurities finally boiled over. I could have lied, but I was so tired of carrying this secret, so exhausted from his constant questioning and suspicious looks. And honestly, part of me wanted him to know the truth so he'd understand what real compassion looks like. So, I told him everything about Ronan reaching out, about how scared he was, about spending that last night with him. I explained how it wasn't about betraying Sterling or our relationship. It was about showing mercy to someone who was dying and afraid. Sterling's face went completely blank. He just stared at me while I tried to explain the circumstances, how it wasn't planned, how it was Ronan's final wish before he died. But Sterling wasn't hearing any of it. He started asking these cold, logical questions about timelines and details, like he was building a case against me. I tried to explain that it wasn't lying. It was protecting him from something he wouldn't understand. But every explanation I gave just seemed to make him angrier. Then he started throwing my own words back at me. How I'd said I wasn't in regular contact with Ronan. How I'd claimed I didn't know he was sick. How I'd lied about where I was that Saturday. When I tried to explain that love isn't finite, that caring about Ronan didn't diminish what I felt for Sterling, he completely shut down. He started talking about trust and betrayal, and how our entire relationship was built on lies, which was so dramatic and unfair. I reminded him about my trauma from my parents' divorce, how their dishonesty affected my ability to trust people. I explained that this situation was different, because it was about compassion, not deception. But Sterling acted like my past trauma was irrelevant. Finally, I got frustrated and told him he was being selfish. Here I was dealing with grief and loss and trying to make sense of an impossible situation, and all he cared about was his own ego. A truly supportive partner would have tried to understand instead of immediately making everything about himself. That's when Sterling said something that really hurt me. He said I was using grief as an excuse, and that being sad doesn't give you permission to cheat. Cheat? Like this was some random hookup instead of a dying man's final request for comfort. I started crying then, not because I felt guilty, but because I realized how different we were as people. I was someone who could show compassion in extreme circumstances, while he was someone who followed rules regardless of context. But Sterling wasn't moved by my tears at all. Usually, when I got upset, he'd soften and try to comfort me. But this time, he just sat there watching me cry, like it was some kind of performance. That's when I knew he'd already made up his mind about everything. When logic didn't work, I got angry. I brought up every time he'd hurt me, every moment he'd been selfish or inconsiderate. Like when he forgot my birthday last year and tried to make up for it with gas station flowers. If we were keeping score of relationship failures, he wasn't exactly perfect either. Sterling just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Cold, almost like he was looking at a stranger. Then he asked if there were other things I'd hidden from him. Other times I'd been in contact with Ronan. Other lies I'd told. And honestly, that question made me realize how little he trusted me. I told him about the occasional texts with Ronan over the years, how we'd check in on each other around birthdays or holidays. Nothing inappropriate, just friendly contact between two people who'd shared a significant relationship. But Sterling acted like every single text was evidence of ongoing betrayal. He wanted to see my phone, go through all our conversations, analyze every interaction. I refused because that felt like a massive violation of privacy. Some conversations are personal, and Ronan had shared things about his illness and fears that weren't meant for anyone else to see. The conversation turned into Sterling listing demands. He wanted me to cut contact with Ronan's family, to stop posting anything about grief or loss on social media, to basically pretend that 6 years of my life had never happened. When I refused his demands, he threatened to call off the wedding. Eventually, I realized there was no point in continuing the conversation. Sterling had made up his mind, and nothing I said was going to change it. He wanted me to grovel and beg for forgiveness for something I didn't believe was wrong, and I wasn't going to do that. So, I did what I always do when someone tries to back me into a corner. I fought back. I told Sterling that if he couldn't understand compassion and forgiveness, then maybe he wasn't the man I thought he was. But Sterling had completely shut down emotionally. Instead of engaging with my points, he started making practical arrangements. The next few days were horrible. Sterling came by to get some clothes and personal stuff, but he wouldn't really talk to me. After 2 years together, that's how he was going to treat me. I tried reaching out to mutual friends for support, but they all seemed uncomfortable getting involved. 3 months later, I found out through Facebook that Sterling was already seeing someone new. Some woman from his office, probably one of those girls who'd been circling around him for months. The pictures of them together made me sick. He looked happy, relaxed, like our entire relationship had meant nothing to him. What really got to me was how quickly he'd moved on. 2 years together, engagement, wedding plans, and he was posting couple photos within months of our breakup. The woman he was dating looked exactly like what you'd expect. Young, bubbly, probably never dealt with any real problems in her life. Meanwhile, I was struggling financially without Sterling's income contribution. My part-time job barely covered rent, and I had to ask my parents for help, which was humiliating. Finding full-time work was harder than I'd expected, and Sterling seemed to be thriving with his promotion and new relationship. The worst discovery came 6 months after our breakup. I ran into Ronan's sister at the grocery store, and she seemed uncomfortable seeing me. When I asked how the family was doing, she got this weird look and said they'd found some of Ronan's journals while cleaning out his apartment. Apparently, he'd written about our last night together, but not the way I remembered it. According to what she told me, he described feeling guilty about asking me to come over, worried that he was being selfish and unfair to my relationship. The journal entries made it sound like the whole thing had been his idea, like he'd manipulated me into it. She didn't say it directly, but I could tell Ronan's family blamed me for taking advantage of him when he was vulnerable and scared. The rumors started spreading through our old social circle. People who'd been sympathetic to my grief suddenly began treating me like I was some kind of predator. Sterling got engaged to his new girlfriend after dating her for only 8 months. The announcement on social media felt like a slap in the face, like he was showing everyone how easy it was to replace me. What made it worse was seeing how his friends and family celebrated the engagement, acting like I'd never existed. A year later, I was barely surviving financially and emotionally. I'd moved back in with my parents because I couldn't afford rent on my own, which felt like the ultimate defeat at 30 years old. Sterling and his fiancée were planning to get married at the same venue I'd originally picked for our wedding. But you know what? I'm done feeling sorry for myself about this whole situation. I'm done letting other people's narrow-minded judgments define who I am or what my actions meant. What I did for Ronan was an act of love and compassion, and I refuse to apologize for that anymore. Sterling showed his true colors when he abandoned me during the most difficult time of my life. A real man would have tried to understand the impossible position I was in. Instead, he turned it into some kind of competition with a dead person and made everything about his own insecurity. Everyone wants to act like I'm the villain in this story, but where were all these people when I was dealing with genuine grief and loss? They were all too busy judging me to offer any real support or understanding. Most people are too comfortable in their black and white thinking to understand nuance or complexity. Sterling can have his perfect little life with his perfect little fiancée. They can live in their perfect bubble where nothing complicated or challenging ever happens. But when real life inevitably hits them, they'll realize how shallow their foundation really is. I'm building a new life now, one that doesn't depend on other people's approval or understanding. I've accepted that some people will always see me as the woman who cheated with her dying ex. And that's their problem, not mine. I refuse to carry their judgment anymore. Sometimes I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he ever questions whether he made the right choice. But honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. He made his decision based on fear and insecurity, and he'll have to live with that. I made mine based on love and compassion, and I can live with that just fine. People can say whatever they want about what happened between Ronan and me that night. They can twist it, judge it, use it as gossip fodder, but I was there. I know what it meant to him in his final days. And I know what it meant to me. That's enough. So, yeah, that's my story. The story of how I lost everything for showing mercy to someone I loved who was dying. How I was abandoned by someone I trusted when I needed support the most. And how I learned that most people would rather judge than understand. But I'm still here, still standing, still believing that what I did was right regardless of what anyone else thinks. And honestly, I sleep just fine at night knowing that Ronan spent his last hours feeling loved instead of alone. That's worth more than Sterling's approval ever was.